If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hello and welcome to If This Goes On, Don't Panic. Today we have writer and historian Ada Palmer. Diane is running late for this episode, so I'm just going to make some announcements and we are going to jump right into it today. And hopefully Diane can join us during the interview part. So just a few things I want to throw out there. I want to remind people that our email is itgodon'tpanic@gmail.com. Currently we have a book giveaway going on. We are giving away some books if you can name at least one of the authors Jamie Lackey from our last interview named as an author to check out. So email us one of those names and I will send you some books. That's all you have to do. Okay, so what else? We also have that surprise still coming up on the horizon. Major progress has been made. I know I've said that last episode too, but really things are coming together for that. That should be sooner than later. And I just want to remind everybody, we have some new columns coming out this year. We just released a new Hope in Horror column, so go and check that out. We have some additional solar punk columns coming up, and we are also going to have Diane's column coming up where she talks about why she likes military SF. So keep your eyes on your feed for that information. All right, so with that, I am going to get to our guest, Ada Palmer. Be right back. Today we have Ada Palmer. Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota series with Tor Books explores a future of borderless nations and globally co-mixing populations. The first volume, Two Like the Lightning, was a Best Novel Hugo finalist, while Ada received the Campbell Award, now called the Astounding Award. Terra Ignota was a finalist for the 2022 Hugo Award for Best Series. She teaches history at the University of Chicago, studying the Renaissance, Enlightenment, heresy, atheism, and censorship. She composes music, including the Viking mythology cycle Sundown, Whispers of Ragnarok, and performs with the group Sassafras. She studies anime/manga, especially Osamu Tezuka, post-World War II manga, and feminist manga, and consults for anime and manga publishers. She blogs and podcasts at exurbe.com. Is that right, Exurbe?
Mm-hmm. Means from the city.
Awesome. So welcome, Ada.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're excited. I want to let you know before we get started that on our Patreon, we have what we call the Patrons Pick, right? And we put up some names of people that we're interested in interviewing, and then our patrons vote. And you were the last person who was chosen in the vote. So
awesome.
Congratulations.
That is a very fun thing to do.
Yeah. We enjoy it. Also, I feel like it takes a little bit of the stress off of us. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, when Joe and I are recording our podcast, we just think of whoever and have them on. It's much less planned and more chaotic, but it makes for much more organic conversation.
Being an ADHD person, I have learned through many years of difficult experience that I'm actually better off planning.
Mm-hmm.
So life has forced me to go there, and now I'm like, I have to plan everything. If Diane were here yet, she would say that she's the opposite. She's the off the cuff, chaos factor. So
well, the correct answer is always to plan the correct amount for the people involved, which is going to be different for every person.
Yeah, totally. I like to, and my planning is, I don't even know, my planning is, how can I say? It's there's definitely a different amount of brain power put in depending on who it is, and their works too. There are just certain people whose stuff, even though I'm very interested in them and I think they're a fascinating person and I love their work, my brain kind of will bounce off of some of their ideas and I will struggle to find what I think are the good questions, like the important themes that I want to cover. And then there's other people where like I have all the questions written down before I'm done with the book. And by the time I'm putting them out on my cheat sheet here, I'm just editing them, and they're good to go. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, when people talk about craft of writing or coaching people in writing, there's often a lot of discussion of character, plot, and setting, as if those are the three things that you're deciding about a book.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a bunch of other ones that are just as significant to the experience of a book, like voice, the manner in which it's told, and theme. What are the defining themes of this book and the ideas that it's bringing to the fore, which can be as formative and important for the experience as the characters. We don't tend to get encouraged to think about those in the stage of, how do you outline a story, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way that themes and questions are woven into a particular book varies enormously, just as much as the way people characterize a character varies enormously from book to book, where sometimes we're in the character's head and know them really well. Sometimes we're more aloof and know them only distantly. Similarly, sometimes the big ideas and themes in a book are very, very palpable and very visible, and sometimes they're very invisible and develop and sort of simmer in the background, and sometimes there will be some of each,
Mm-hmm.
because the techniques involved in actually seeding the themes in through the structure of the book can vary a lot, just as much as one can vary by writing
Mm-hmm.
in first person or third.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I often approach books through theme because I feel like the podcast has we have an outspoken mission statement theme, right? And then we have the themes within a particular book, within a writer's body of work that touches on either that outspoken theme that we have, or maybe a theme that's presented itself like in the last 4 or 5 podcasts, or something that's been on our minds lately, or something that's happening in the world, right? So it's interesting to see how a person's body of work combines with the current environment outside of their work in my life and in our podcast, and then seeing how all of that kind of comes together, right? And trying to put those themes together in a way that makes sense and holds things together for our listeners too, which I've never really thought about it that way, and it makes it sound way more cool than it actually is.
A lot of things are way more cool than they seem on the surface when we just actually sit down and think about all of the incredibly sophisticated design steps that went into things like a fork.
Let's talk about some of the themes from your book. One of the interesting things, well, from your books, I shouldn't say book, is you're very much exploring the freedom to allow people to be who they are, right? And you're doing that in a number of ways. You've got the bashes, which I think are extremely interesting. You've got the way that religion is treated, right? And for those who have not read any of Ada's Terra Ignota series, you have these things called senseiers, who kind of like are I'm just going to kind of like your personal priest almost, right?
Yeah, well, it's halfway between a therapist
Yes.
and a priest, because the person is an expert on a wide variety of religions and philosophies, having studied them, but without advancing or ascribing to a particular one. In fact, they're legally forbidden to. The idea is that this is somebody you can talk to about religious beliefs who will be able to tell you, oh, that idea you've been batting around is, existed in this particular branch of Confucianism in the 6th century, and also existed in this particular branch of, atheist philosophy that thrived in the 19th century, and would bring to you the different examples of ideas that resonate with yours or that challenge yours from all different types and sects and geographies and time periods, to help you bounce your own ideas off of those provided by history and therefore refine your own belief system without anybody advancing a particular one. Proselytizing is illegal.
Yes. I love that idea so much. I just want to quickly say that the society within your novels are also kind of like allowing more freedom within the gender spectrum, right? Because everyone's a they. You're not really, they don't think about it in the same way that we think about it now, as more of a binary, right? I do want to go back to the senseiers because I have found that idea extremely fascinating. And I do wish that those existed in our time because, when I was younger, I went through I don't know, I guess I don't want to say it was a crisis, but I went through a lot to find where I was on that religious spiritual level, right?
Mhm.
A lot of reading, a lot of rejecting other people's ideas and being rejected myself
Mhm.
for my opinions.
Well, and most of the trained authority figures who have expertise in it are also trained and or employed in ways in which they're supposed to be advancing a particular belief. There are,
Exactly.
professors of history of religion that you can go study with at a university who will present a more neutral, here are all the cool ideas, let's have fun batting them around. But, college is not very many years of your life. The leisure to continue having continuing ed classes in history of religion is not expected and not trivial to fit into your life.
Right.
And our world is full of religious and philosophical authority figures who are trained to try to bend people toward a particular system. This is what if society provides a wide variety of people who are just as easy to get a hold of as calling your local insert religion here authority figure, but who are
Uh-huh.
neutral on the system and therefore will guide you through whatever ideas you have.
Yeah, 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 absolutely, 100%. I started out as a Presbyterian, you know what I mean? And it's not like I could go and ask my Presbyterian preacher, hey, what about Buddhism? You know what I mean? Like, what about, I don't know, something else? You know what I mean?
Well,
Like, it's
sometimes
not,
there are really great people in the religious structures of any given faith who will gladly discuss the exciting merits of some of the other faiths. There are people
yeah,
around like that, but you have to find them among the people who are not like
yeah,
that.
exactly. Yes, yes. Yeah. So, what led you to this idea of the sensayer?
I mean, partly an experience of how different it is to be studying histories of religious ideas in, the academic context of studying, going to a liberal arts college, enjoying discussing these things versus
Mhm.
when you're encountering it within the structures of an established religion. But another reason is that one of the major methods that I used, not just for that, but for lots of elements of the world building of Terra Ignota, was to put on my historian hat and say, okay, what aspects of our society right now are definitely in the middle of changing and are definitely unstable and will not in a couple hundred years be the way they are now.
Mhm.
Because some things can be very stable or not over a long time. But it's very clear if you look around that the relationship should be between religion and individual people and government is very in flux right now. And different countries are doing things very differently. And even within individual countries, there's a lot of controversy and disagreement about that issue compared to, past centuries in which there have been many problems with what the actual answer was that the society arrived at, but there was a lot more consensus on the relationship between religion and government should be X. Similarly, like gender, right now, it's definitely the case that we're in flux in terms of how our society is handling gender.
Absolutely.
That doesn't mean anybody can predict the way our society will have settled on handling gender 200 years from now. But whatever it is, it's going to be a change. Whether that change is openness or closedness or progressive or retrogressive or complicated, will we settle on getting rid of a binary? Will we instead have a trinary that is just as rigid as the binary ever was? There are lots of things that could be what's going to happen, but what's not going to happen is for it to stay unchanged, right? And that's a really good way to do world building, is to say, okay, what are 5 things about our present that definitely can't stay the way they are because they've been changing over the past decades and are definitely going to keep changing over the next? Then brainstorm what are several different ways that could end up. And then ask, do they combine interestingly? Is there an imagined version of how gender could end up and an imagined version of how religion could end up that if they intersect with each other would be extra cool? If so, that combo is good for your world build.
I love that. I love that. Well, that brings me to another question I wanted to ask you. How do you use history to influence your world building?
I mean, tons and tons. It's sort of hard to say whatever doesn't use history because actually history turns out to be everything that everybody ever did ever. And
Right.
so if we base our world building on anything, we are in fact basing it on history. It's a very large field. But being a historian means that you're trained to look at the way things change over time, Some people say, isn't being a historian the opposite of being a science fiction writer because you're looking at the past instead of the future? But the answer is no, there's nothing more similar to the future than the past. It's a long period of time in which society changed slowly, only sometimes quickly, and was disrupted by various events and technological changes. There's nothing that is more like the future than the past, in as much as we use it to look at how change happens. And specifically, unlike the majority of historians right now who study, we need the most histories of recent times. That's what we produce the most of. That's what students are most excited to take classes on. So a minority of historians look before the 18th century. But as a historian who looks at a long time ago and is very used to thinking in terms of many centuries or a couple of millennia, it gives you a lot of space to zoom out and to think about, what kinds of things are fast, what kinds of things are slow, what kinds of things when they change tend to change very rapidly and be adopted, what kinds of things when they change tend to hang on for 500 years before you see a major change in it. And it makes it easier for me to look at things that are changing on a multi-century timescale. So, for example, one of the things that's definitely in flux right now is the family unit. What is the combination of people who by default live in one family unit within one home? Because for the vast majority of human history, and indeed still in the majority of the earth now, it was an extended multi-generation family in which there would be grandparents, parent generation, younger generation, in which there would often be multiple adult married couples where, two brothers both have wives. They are living in a large and extended within one home family, often in the majority of history with multiple families within the same home, because there would be the wealthier family that owns the building. And then there would also be the servant level people who are often families themselves. So you had a family unit, which was, between 8 and 50, not between 2 and 8, and in which a lot of labor was therefore able to be shared and collaborative. And the raising of a child was not on 2 adults. It was the raising of 3 children by 15 adults. And the way owning an object or even having resources like a kitchen, the resource load on a society having 1 kitchen per 2 people versus 1 kitchen per 20 people is a much greater resource load of how much material that is kitchen you have to produce, right? So in the 20th century, largely led by the USA and certain cultural shifts, there was this idealization of the nuclear family and the idea that one couple living alone with just them, their kids, and maybe a visiting nanny or housekeeper, and that's it, was proof of success. And a lot of society in the US and a few other places tried to orient around that to the degree that that's the default assumed family unit in the vast majority of modern written science fiction. But that is a really recent unit that's already falling apart because it kind of depended on one partner working and the other partner not working and helping to raise kids. And it depended on a very particular moment in the history of employment that happened and then dissolved as the aftermath of women working in World War II advanced. And, it's already the case that you can go online and find tons and tons of articles about how young people are living together in communes or moving back into the urban space from the suburbs, the draining of the suburbs, etc. All of that tells you the family unit in 200 years won't be that. We don't know what it will be, but it definitely won't be that because it's only been that very recently. But you don't notice that if you only look back 60 years. You notice it if you look back 100 or 200 years. And you'll notice it if you look beyond America and other elements of the developed world that are culturally impacted by America and look at the fact that the vast majority of people live in larger family units with multi-generational or even multi-family housing.
I love that. And I think that might be Diane. Hang on. Diane, is that you?
Sorry, I'm late.
Hey. That's okay. We're in the middle of chatting. Let me tell you what we're talking about. We were just talking about how the family unit basically is starting to change, and Ada was talking about how you can see these kind
You
of...
can look at society, you look at a society and you can tell what is in the process of changing and is unstable. How's family unit right now is definitely in the process of changing and unstable. The modern nuclear family is very recent. It doesn't work very well. It's being disrupted by changes in employment where both spouses work, etc. Multifamily, historic ways of living are much more common and have a lot of reason to resurge. We don't know what will happen, but something will happen. Similarly, gender. The way we deal with gender right now definitely won't be the way we're dealing with gender in 100 years, because we're in the process of having a lot of transformation and change and tension and progress about gender. And I can't predict whether in 200 years we'll be way more liberated on the front of gender or there will be a crackdown and everything will be retrogressive. But whatever it is, it will not be identical to right now, because right now isn't identical to 5 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. As an example of how one really great way to world build a science fiction story is to look around society and say, what are 3 or 4 things that are in flux, that are definitely going to be changing over the coming decades and won't be the same in 100 years? And then take those and run with them for your world build. And it can be gender, it can be family unit, it can be transportation system, it can be our relationship with food, it can be all sorts of things.
And yeah, I really was interested in hearing what you had to say, Diane, because I know your family unit in particular is different than the nuclear family, right? Because we had been focusing on the families. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess my own family is kind of an example of things being changing, the fact that I don't know. I know what you guys were saying when I came in, right? I thought it was an especially valid point that the nuclear family is new and doesn't work very well. Can't agree with you more, right? I have kind of a unique found family situation. For instance, I have 2 romantic partners that I am dedicated to. We are a group, right? I have a lot of adopted kids, as it were. And I think for me, that's a reaction to the fact that the nuclear family doesn't work very well, and it didn't work very well for me as a kid, right? So I tend to surround myself with found family, I guess in some way trying to imitate that greater family unit that we used to have in the past with multi-generations and, everybody looking after their sisters and brothers' kids and that kind of thing, right? And because I don't have that naturally, I kind of artificially created it in my life, and it works. It does work.
And this is a trend that, articles confirm has been happening a lot, that lots of either found family units or multi-generation units or, 2 couples joining or polycules, lots of different combined social units like this, where you have a number of adults and then raising together a number of kids, has been really surging because it works better. And it doesn't just work better in terms of you get more emotional and social support and other people are sharing labor. It even works more efficiently in terms of resources and conservation.
Yeah.
I can also confirm that directly. Our polycule bought a house, and we did that 2 years ago, and we would not have been able to afford to do that on our own individually at all. So yeah.
Well, and our world is full of buildings that were designed for households of that size that have since been, partitioned into multiple apartments and are now being unpartitioned again into shared social units.
Yeah.
All over the place, there are houses that nobody quite wants to buy because it'll be a 8-bedroom house or something. And people are, why does that even exist? Well, because there were actually 8 bedrooms worth of people who often lived in a house when this house was built.
Yeah. Very good point there.
I know it's to the point where my wife and I have even sort of joked like, maybe we need to find a third person.
Or another couple. I know couples who share houses with 2 couples in a house, so that even if people are still within a traditional marriage, that doesn't mean you can't be within a multi-family household.
I've done that too. I have a friend named Rowan, and we like to joke we raised each other's kids, which we did, right? Our families lived together in order to make ends meet because we were all in a disadvantaged economic situation. And now her boys call me auntie, and, my kids call her auntie, and, we still look after each other. My nephew ended up here because he had no place to go a couple weeks ago. And it does work. I honestly do believe that the multi-generational, multi-family model is better for everyone. It's better for the kids. It's better for economics. It's better for the adults. It's even better for our elders, right? Like I'm just starting to get into being a grandma and I love it so much. And it would never have happened without my particular family unit, the way it works. So.
Yeah, well, and another way to describe the reason for that is that it's a unit with a lot more resilience. When things are disrupted or there needs to be a change, a nuclear family which was designed around the single breadwinner idea, in which, there's a careful plan to effectively have the kids who need labor to be put into watching them. Every minute of the parent's time is very carefully rationed for care of the kid when, or hiring the babysitter for X or Y, or when exactly the kid is at school, when exactly X thing happens, so that when it goes wrong, when there's a disruption in employment, when there's a disruption in health, there is no resilience to this system. Whereas when you have more people, there's a lot more resilience when there's a disruption of income, when there's a disruption where there's illness in the family, when somebody is unable to put in the usual labor. Just like a bridge or a building that's built in a region with earthquakes that's designed for earthquakes, the plural adult household is much more like an earthquake-proof building. The nuclear family is very much like the kind of brittle building that only stands when you assume there will never be earthquakes.
Very good point.
Yes.
Can't agree with you more, like I say.
Yeah. To bring it back to your book, you kind of explore this through the idea of bashes, right? And I mentioned earlier, you seem to explore a certain kind of freedom in your novels. And I want to compare it a little bit to Malka Older's Infomocracy to a certain degree, because I feel like, and I don't know if you've read those or not, but she has people moving between, hers is more politically focused, but people can easily move between different, forget the exact word she has from, but they're basically like mini countries, right? And a certain amount of people creates a different government.
Both that series and mine, and this is one of the reasons she and I so enjoy discussing them with each other and why they're really fun to compare to each other, are very interested in the question of right of exit.
Yes.
And how when it is easier to exit a political situation and enter a different one,
yes,
there are a whole lot of changes that has, not only on the individual, but on the whole society and on the government.
Yes.
And both in her system, where every time you move from one microregion to another, you're moving from one area of government to another. And also, every time there's an election, you might elect a completely different government to rule the area where you are, so that you have frequent turnover of not who's in office, but what actual political structure is being used.
Yes.
Similarly, in mine, we have these global nations called hives that people choose to sign up for when you come of age based on choosing the one whose ideology best matches how you feel you think you want a society that governs you to be run. But you can exit immediately. If your government takes a turn you don't like, you can just immediately leave. And the governments compete with each other to appeal to citizens. And many people stay in one government their whole lives, and many other people might change 3 or 4 times. And there's always a right of exit. That makes a kind of accountability exist, in which if a government starts going in a direction that the vast majority of its populace doesn't like, they'll start bleeding citizens very rapidly, and citizens leaving also bring tax value and power away with them. So the government is much more answerable to its people if there is a right of exit. And there are lots of ways to explore right of exit. But right now, emigration is actually really, really hard. And one encounters the rhetoric a lot of, if my country does X, I will move to, other country next door. For the US, it would often be Canada. But actually emigrating is really, really difficult. Years of paperwork, enormous costs, both financial and social, uprooting employment, uprooting support structures.
Yes.
Malka and I are both very interested in the question of what happens when right of exit is suddenly easy. And how does that change how accountable a government can be to its people. Both she and I agree that the answer is it doesn't solve everything. It's not that right of exit would magically mean that the governments are never a problem. Both she and I depict moments where these governments are a problem. But I think a good way to put it is when a government with a right of exit goes bad, it goes like only 10% as bad. Yeah, the worst it can be is way better than the worst that a government can be when it doesn't have a meaningful right of exit. So it just makes the entire how bad can you be elevated so that there's an average, much higher functionality among all the governments.
I really like that idea. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't know, kind of a real world, like miniature comparison. Okay. Right now, I'm not saying Canada is by any means perfect. There is a lot of stuff we can do better. But one thing that I've noticed is that we have greater job mobility. And the reason why we do, like than the United States, I mean, right? And the reason why is because our healthcare is not tied to our job. It's really that simple, right? Yep. If we suddenly decide we're going to move and take a different job, we don't have to wait for our healthcare to kick in. We don't have to talk to a new insurance company. As long as we're in the same province, our healthcare just comes with us, right? So as a result, we have a higher average wage when compared to the cost of living, right? And it's that little change. That's all that took.
Well, and also, higher life expectancy, higher everyday happiness, higher all sorts of things.
So I love this idea of right of exit in governments. Sign me up. Can we do it this way, please? I like this plan.
The model for this is the EU, right? Which sat there and said, what if we make our borders porous and make it so that people can very easily have the ability to move from one place to another? And there are many flaws in the current EU as well. Every real system is imperfect. There are no frictionless spheres the way there are in the world of thought experiment. But it is neat to see how many things in Europe are better and helped because of that porousness and because of that ability to relocate more easily from one place to another. That was one of the reasons for making the EU in the first place, and was unilaterally correct about having large positive effects.
And then in addition to that, you have what you call black laws, gray laws, and white laws, right? And these are groups of people who attend to the laws wherever they are living in different ways. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes. So it's a complex system, and there is this global alliance system within which you live, and it has a set of sort of generic laws, which are very uncontroversial basic laws, like murder is illegal. People who own property own that property, and if you steal their property, then there are consequences of this. You're not allowed to go dump a bunch of polluting acid in the middle of the street. The kinds of laws that are close to social consensus. These are the gray laws, and generically any person on Earth is by default protected by these. But you can instead choose to join one of the hives, each of which offers a robust set of complicated laws that might be slightly different. The cousins are a hive, for example, that care a lot more about having a lot of social support and social services. They do a lot of, charity work, etc. So for them, they provide a lot more of, we take care of all of your educational costs. Here they are. But on the other hand, we, absolutely mandate vaccines, and it's illegal for you to be a member of us and not, do this health program that we've come up with, etc. So on the extremely motherly end of social government. But, then there are others, one of which is Mitsubishi, who are much more excited by ideas of sort of competition and human excellence and the kind of political spirit you see at the Olympics, and value people going forth and being outstandingly awesome at whatever it is that they're doing, whether it's sports or art or computer programming or baking the most impressive cookies ever. They do it with a very Olympic competitive spirit. So different people can sign up for those. Or they also offer the black laws, where you personally choose that you want to live in a much more anarchic context and decide to opt out of the generic kinds of gray laws and live under an extremely minimalist set of what are called the black laws, of which there are only a few. One of them is you may not torture children. Another of them is you may not take action largely likely to cause massive scale, uncontrollable destruction of the planet or human civilization. But murder is not actually illegal under the black laws. It only bans those things that sort of at an absolute minimum, even people who are at spirit anarchist would agree, we will not torture children. And if somebody is torturing children, we will stop them. In the case of a black law, usually by murdering them, because other black laws can, of course, murder each other. But it just means that there's a variety of different legal systems that people can choose among. And by default, when you're growing up, you are under the gray law system. And then when you choose to take an exam that when you have passed, it means you are now an adult. When you choose to become an adult, you also choose which legal system you're governed by. And, at that point, you enter adult citizenship and adult political responsibility, which you can do at whatever age you feel you're ready for that. And then choose among these different governments, whether it's to be one of the sort of big, large, competitive with each other giant unions. One of them is the European Union, for example, or whether you want to stick to this sort of more generic, this is a universal law code that was worked out by a United Nations-like, global consortium. And I'm going to follow either the anarchist black version, the average gray version, or there's also a more socially more rigid about social protections, white law version that, for example, mandates more health checks and outlaws, various things like recreational drugs and prostitution, which the gray ones don't. And so people can choose the legal code that they want to live by and be governed by.
I just think that's super fascinating and super complex. Like, I can't imagine trying to actually...
Sure you can. Like, the vast majority of the earth has had multiple overlapping legal systems at the same time always. What do you think church law was all the way through the Middle Ages? Nobody had any problem with understanding that if there's a murder in a town and one of the people involved in it is somebody who works for the bishop, then it's going to be tried under church law. Otherwise, it's going to be tried under local earl's law, unless somebody is related to a noble family from somebody else, in which case it's going to be tried under Roman law. Like, even medieval villages had 3 different legal systems going on at the same time, and nobody had trouble navigating this.
Interesting.
It's more common than not for there to be multiple competing legal systems in a region.
You have a point. And there's also, the difference between social consensus and laws, and social consensus might as well be laws, right? So,
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I find myself wondering if that would work or not, right? If you had a group that was, running around under, okay, I don't believe in white, and the way you describe it, I don't believe in white laws because I think that's none of your damn business, right? And I don't believe in black laws because I think people are crazy. And if you let the psychopaths run free, then...
So an important detail to wrap your head around with the black law thing is you personally are protected by the legal system you have chosen. If you have chosen to be in one of the ones where murder is illegal, it is illegal to murder you. And even if a black law is there, if they murder you, they are prosecuted under your law because you are the victim.
Cool. Okay. Right? But how do you enforce it? Like, I'm curious. So I'm not saying this is a bad idea. I'm just curious.
With the black laws, there are 2 ways. A, your police exist and can arrest the person. The person might try to fight back, but they can still be, prosecuted for hurting the people. It's all under the legal system of the person who was affected. B, among the black laws themselves, if the black laws cause trouble, it's legal for anybody else to kill them. And that holds you to a pretty darn high standard of social behavior, because if somebody is pissed at the black law, they can just kill the black law, and the black law has waived the right to have defense. So the black laws police themselves and each other, and in the book there is the unofficial law, quote, "We will not anger the Leviathans," in which black laws are extremely severe in cracking down on other black laws who cause trouble, because they need to be on their best behavior, or the much larger majorities that don't like this can just crush them. So would it work if this were the majority society? No. But as a vein of a small population within a larger population, holding themselves to very high ethical standards, because if they don't, The fact that they have waived legal protections means that they are the ones in the vulnerable position, means that they police each other. And we see in the book both ways that this works and ways that it doesn't.
Like criminal societies, for example, who have very generally enforced their own strict honor codes on each other.
Exactly.
Valid. Okay, I can see it. Mm-hmm. Cool. Interesting.
And, even if 0.01% of the population chooses to do this, the fact that it's there as an option means that the people who are, for example, debating whether a thing that is controversial should or shouldn't be banned under the gray laws, the fact that there is a black law option and indeed a white law option makes those conversations more interesting and robust and means that you have more options. And so when someone comes forward and says, we think we should ban pH adjusted bottled water because it has XYZ negative effect, the debate over it isn't, should we ban this? The debate over it is, should it be considered the human norm for this to be banned? Or should this be something that's only banned if you're a white law, you've decided to opt into, every single study that says if we do X, it would be better for society is now mandatory.
Right.
Or is it something so extreme that, in fact, it should be illegal even for a black law, right? So the black law clause that you may not take action likely to cause large scale and uncontrollable damage to the planet means, no, you can't go start using ozone layer destroying chemicals again. Right?
We could almost use a black law group.
Yeah.
Someone to go, okay, yeah, you guys, you big multinational corporations who are, consistently doing things like the latest crap, which is, altering the data, with systems developed to hide their carbon output, right? Maybe there should be a bit of a more severe penalty, right? Yeah.
The problem is accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
When governments are sufficiently secure in office such that it's very difficult for their citizens to either oust them or exit, then they can do things that are pretty darn terrible, and there's very little you can do about it because there isn't accountability. There isn't an alternative. So all sorts of things that can be done to increase accountability, of which black logs existing is one. Ungerrymandering districts is another. Having an easier process for voting people out, or having a thing where, here in Chicago, for example, ballot initiatives can be voted on by society, but aren't binding on politicians. They're just a way of showing that a large number of voters think that X is a good idea. But, we voted years ago that we wanted to raise the minimum wage to a $15 minimum wage. And this was an overwhelmingly popular vote. But there was no actual accountability factor. It was a legally non-binding resolution. If it were a legally binding resolution, the effects would be very different. So all different kinds of structures can increase accountability. And anything that increases accountability, therefore, increases the likelihood that people who have a corrupt reason to do something bad will also have a mechanism to keep them from doing so.
I see the validity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. First, I want to commend you for bothering to think of an alternative social organization. And Diane knows this, but one of my soapboxes is, why is science fiction always either a corrupt corporation has taken over or we live in a kingdom again? You know what I mean? Why is there never anything different than that? So thank you.
Well, there's also the Star Trek type, space federations.
That's true.
It's funny to say this, but there are sometimes changes in consensus in what types of futures are considered plausible and acceptable within science fiction. And I can give a couple of examples. So, for example, right now, if you wrote a story that was a science fiction story that took place on Earth within the next 150 years, and in the story, the climate crisis just isn't there and is unmentioned, and the things that are happening are incompatible with it, it would be very difficult for most people to find that plausible.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, when you're writing in the phase of the Cold War, in which everyone is pretty sure that humanity is going to be wiped out in a nuclear holocaust, if you wrote a story set 150 years later and didn't include an explanation of why the Earth wasn't wiped out by a nuclear holocaust, or maybe it was and this is afterward, that would be considered implausible, right? Because there were consensuses about the kinds of things that are likely to happen, which needed to be addressed. Sometimes these are genuine majority consensuses, like everyone in the Cold War wanting to get an explanation for why the Earth hasn't been blown up if it hasn't been blown up. Sometimes they're majority consensuses, and you see this in the people who are really excited with the idea of the singularity and will say, I don't bother to read SF where the singularity hasn't happened because it's not plausible. That's a minority consensus, but there are still consensuses, right? And within that, there are also often consensuses of what types of forms of government coming about in the future are likely or unlikely. How likely is it that we will have one world government versus not? And there's a phase in, say, the 1960s through early 80s at least, in which the vast majority of science fiction just assumes that we're moving toward a one world government. And that the future will be Earth is one government and there'll be Earth Gov something. And they can decide what kind of system it will be, but very, very difficult to find anything where at that far in the future, there's still separate countries unless something has happened to cause a disruption of the natural movement toward one world government, right? So there are consensuses and patterns in terms of what people think is plausible. And right now, there's so much anxiety about capitalism that corporate-dominated futures loom very large in the imagination palette of, if you sit down with someone and ask them what's a likely future, that's really high on the list of things they're going to say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep. We are living in the cyberpunk dystopia that science fiction writers tried to warn us about.
That's one of Diane's soapboxes.
This is it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's one of my soapboxes. Another one of my soapboxes, I see your point here again, right? Guys, American science fiction writers, please let me appeal to you, okay? Please stop assuming that healthcare costs money to the individual in the future. Please stop that, right? Because most of the world doesn't do it that way, right? They don't. There are social programs that you opt into or that are part of your government. And that is how most of the world does it, right? It's just a constant thing, that I've noticed in American science fiction in particular. It's like, okay, so, all this stuff happens as a result of, healthcare being the problem. Dude, you guys are the exception, please, I beg you, as someone from another country.
Well, that's a problem that people always have when they're basing stuff on their own country, right? And it becomes noticeable when you realize it's contingent. Like, I watch a lot of anime, and I especially love when Japan is doing an adaptation of a really well-known to me European historical setting, because you'll sometimes get these really wonderful moments. Like, there's a point in Rose of Versailles, which is taking place in the lead up to the French Revolution, when the main character does a thing that dishonors the family in front of the king. And then the protagonist gets dragged aside by their father, and the father is yelling at them and saying, now we have to commit seppuku. And I'm like, no, you don't. You're French. It's the 18th century. It's fine. Nobody is going to expect you to commit seppuku. You might have to go to Portugal or something, but and it's exactly the same thing as the, paying for healthcare in American fiction. It's just people are very used to the world working X way, and then that will appear in a version of fiction.
I know. I know that. I'm just saying, right? And it would be less of a problem if it weren't the world government. It's the Terran government, and everybody is paying.
Yeah. But remember, it's not universal, right? Nobody pays for healthcare in Star Trek.
I know. That's lovely.
And Star Trek was much more of a one world government idea than it was a everything becomes America corporate idea. And I do think one of the reasons that American SF now has a lot more paying for healthcare than American SF did 50 years ago is the expectation that there's going to be a lot more corporate domination of the formation of whatever the future system is.
If corporations are the government, then damn rights we're paying for healthcare. Right. We're paying for water. probably paying for the air.
Or even if it isn't, right? The U.S. government isn't corporations are the government, but it is corporations have twisted the government so that the government has a lot of features which are designed to facilitate corporations, including the way the healthcare system works.
Valid.
Now, if corporations in the future aren't the government, but are very, very, very powerful, it's the sort of thing they can plausibly manipulate a government into. But you also want to come up with other neat ones, like, the ones Corodactro is really good at coming up with, where you need to have copyrighted bread go into your copyrighted toaster.
I love that story. That was such a good story. Okay, well, we're getting close on time here. A couple more questions, though, for you, Ada. One big question that I'm wondering right now is, as a historian, with the rise of authoritarianism and everything, like, with your historical perspective, what is happening, do you think? And maybe this is too predictive, but how do you think things will go?
And how do you think? Fix it?
I was going to try to get that predictive.
So beginning with the don't panic. The patterns that we're living through right now that are causing the crises and the tensions and the enormous perceptions of fear aren't new. It's that they've surged and died away and surged and died away in cycles repeatedly since 1450. Because what we're living in right now is an information technology revolution. Whenever there's an information technology revolution, the world is terrifying and upside down. And this has been constantly a problem ever since the movable type printing press, which was the first of a long sequence of disruptive information technologies that sped and changed the way information moves. And if you doubt this, Shakespeare has rants about how scared people are of fake news. And all of the same crises that we're facing right now, they were facing then. Because whenever there's a new information technology that makes information move usually faster, but not necessarily faster, sometimes just differently, it means that no systems to censor and regulate that new medium exist yet. There's a lag between the new medium arriving and the culture coming up with ways to police that new medium. Which means that as soon as the new medium comes into being, the first adopters of that are going to include all the groups that couldn't communicate under the old medium. There's always a cost to adopting a new way of communicating. It might be purchasing new software, building a printing press, building a radio transmitter, getting on the telegraph wired hub. Or it can just be a cost in time, building up your base anew, learning to use yet another app, right? We've all had I don't want to have to learn Blue Sky after Mastodon. That weariness one feels is the cost in time of adopting the new system, which means the first people to jump into it are going to be the people who have a strong reason to jump in there, which are always going to include the people who were silenced under the old system. That means it will always include sex workers. It will always include immigrants and linguistic minorities, and religious minorities, and it will always include the radical political fringes of whatever the political radical controversies are at the time.
This is great. Carry on. Yes.
The first adopters of the printing press, when it was modified to the point that what we call pamphlet culture and pamphlet production began, which is really the first fast-moving social media network. The first adopters included all the radical religious movements on the far fringes of things. It also included pornography, as you would always expect, and it also included all of the minorities within sectors. But what this means is that the new information technology always suddenly magnifies the scariest voices in the society. And it doesn't matter who you fear. It's going to magnify the people you fear. It might also magnify some people you like. If we look at the Ditto machine, which is a brilliant example, also known as the mimeograph. I don't know if you've ever been the right age to see these. It's a small reproduction technology that uses smelly chemicals and makes a sheet of paper that reproduces a page of text that's kind of blue. When I was a kid, it was what my teacher used to make our homework because there weren't Xerox machines yet. And these were the first way to inexpensively print something in small numbers at home, ideal for producing newsletters. The mimeograph revolution led to the beginning of sending a lot of newsletters through the mail. And early adopters of the mimeograph as a way of making newsletters and flyers and circulators stimulated a huge number of communities to form. Trekkies and the first science fiction fans organize themselves via the mimeograph. Tropical fish fanciers and specialist dog breeding clubs organize themselves via the mimeograph. Groups that are just not important enough to merit a column in a newspaper. Queer, gay and lesbian social groups organize themselves via this. Civil rights activist groups. These were huge shapers of the civil rights movement because they could put together and circulate flyers. And the KKK was a major adopter of the mimeograph, and KKK recruitment surged as a result of this technology. So every time there's an information revolution, it empowers all of these fringe voices, and you get KKK flyers at the same moment you get like the first Mandarin language newspaper in Texas, right? All of these different empowerments of huge numbers of components of the population that were silent before, those becoming loud cause all of the issues to flare up and everything to become heated, complicated. You see the authoritarians surging, but the authoritarians see the queers surging. Everyone sees surging and empowerment and magnification of whatever makes them uncomfortable. And you have a period of turmoil when suddenly it seems like there are 10 times as many enemies as you thought. And it's just that anyone you think of as an enemy is 10 times louder. So that is what we are experiencing right now. Yes, it's scary. Yes, it can cause tumults. Yes, it's affecting our government right now. Yes, elections all over the world are seeing authoritarians come into power. Elections all over the world are also seeing extremely radical progressives come into power also. We're seeing extremes on both ends. And, my best answer is this is normal. We've been doing this since 1450. We know how to do this. Humanity has been living in a constant sequence of information revolutions for more than 500 years. We are an information revolution species. It's always really alarming when it starts, but we have lived through it and we will live through it again. The difference is that we understand it because we have better studies of it and we know what's happening. So we can tell ourselves what's happening, understand that those voices are not suddenly present. They are instead suddenly magnified, and then try to act prudently on that as the society works out how do we cope with those voices in here that are genuinely dangerous, like hate speech.
That's fantastic. Thank you for giving me some framework and some meaning. This makes perfect sense to me. I have 2 anecdotal stories that I want to share. I'll try to make them both brief. The first one is my husband was a taxi driver, right? Okay. And one thing that we cannot understand, right, with the whole, Uber and whatnot stuff that happens is why suddenly, if you order a taxi on your phone, all the regulations go away, right? There are numerous regulations for being a taxi, right? You have to have a certain level of commercial license so that you're safe to drive people around, right? Your vehicle requires inspection, the company requires regulation. They only give out a certain amount of taxi licenses in a given area. Why the hell aren't they doing this with Uber? This makes no sense, right? And it's leading to all kinds of risks, chaos, abuse of employees, etc., right? But magically, all of a sudden, if it's on a phone, it's different. I don't understand that, right? Okay. And the second story is, okay, so I was an early internet adopter, right? And exactly like, for all the reasons you have given, right? I'm a member of a variety of subcultures. I'm queer, right? There's a bunch of, obviously I'm in a polycule relationship, right?
And you're like, here are my people. I hear them. This new technology.
Right? It's exactly it. It's exactly what it was. Science fiction nerd. I'm all of that. Right. And then I got on Blue Sky. Right. And I'm like, oh, and here's all the same people, all the, sex workers, all the kinky people, all the queer people, all the neurodiverse people, all the science fiction nerds, all the furries. I know all you people. Right. You were here when we started BBSs. Yeah. You're here now. Awesome. Right. So, yeah, I see it. I really see it in my own experience. So thank you. I actually really feel that's reassuring.
Yeah. The stakes, we've done this before. I mean, on the Uber and taxi one, that's also a very interesting example of the larger phenomenon where When there is a slight change in something that exists, there then comes a moment in which, legal trials occur to determine whether does A count as a type of this thing that already exists, or is it a new thing? And, a bunch of case law is then developed to determine whether this counts as this thing or not. And those decisions, which are generally made through the courts, are, very complicated depending on how much money can influence your political system. It's often very political. And they mean that sometimes something, by changing some detail around it, can jump out of and be suddenly policed and categorized differently in a way that may not make sense. And I'll give first a hypothetical example and then a real example. But, let's imagine that in the 19th century, people invented really fabulous tricycles and tricycle wagons. And there was a giant and robust tricycle-based infrastructure. And then there would be lots of rules about the production of tricycles and the safety regulations of tricycles and the width of roads for tricycles, etc. And then suddenly someone invents the bicycle. There would be a moment in which somebody had a bicycle, they did something, there was an accident, and then someone went before a judge, and the judge has to decide, do tricycle laws apply to bicycles, or are bicycles different? And the decision is made based on the arguments made by the lawyers hired by the two sides.
Uh-huh.
And that is the way innovations get integrated into existing case law. But it also means that a lot of the time, the more a law specifies, if it hadn't said tricycle, if it instead had said pedal-powered, unpowered, horse-free vehicle, then there would be no debate as to whether a unicycle, bicycle, tricycle, or quadricycle are all that thing. So it can have to do with how specific our laws are when we make them. And a lot of the time when we make laws, they're very specific in ways that then get multiplied out to be very general and can make it harder for them to be future-proof. And here's the concrete example where this matters. One of the biggest problems, as you're probably aware right now, is our news system is really terrible.
Oh, God.
Right?
Don't even get me started on this.
There are a lot of problems with news. And I'm a big fan of the Fix the News newsletter, which does a roundup of all the good news that gets underreported because bad news gets 100 times as many clicks. But fundamentally, what broke the news was the transition to being online instead of paper. Because all of the regulations and processes for making the news functional were directly connected with the idea that it was physical newspapers and they were printed locally in a place, and the local version would have national stories, but also local stories, and they would then be sent physically through the mail and interact with people in different ways. And this was core to their funding structure because, and here I'm zooming in on America as the example, newspapers were always subsidized by the government. From the very beginning of the U.S. government, it was decided that only a well-educated citizenry would be capable of voting, that the circulation of news would be essential to that citizenry, and thus that the government should subsidize newspapers. The method that was chosen to do this was the post office. And this is what media mail is. Media mail was created so that when newspapers are sent through the mail, the government pays for most of the costs, making newspapers way cheaper than they really were in order to subsidize the circulation of news. Right. It was also the case that it was free, fully paid for on the government dime, for a newspaper to send its news to another newspaper. So if a paper in New York and a paper in Los Angeles make a partnership where they send each other their editions every day so that the California news can be reported in New York one day late, the government would pay for that process. All of this meant that newspapers never paid for themselves. News was never self-sustaining and was sustained on a combination of government subsidies, ad revenue primarily from the local sellers of large ticket items like washing machines and cars, and then subsidies from above from the local patriarchs of small towns who believed that they got sort of local cred for being the funder behind the newspaper, when journalism actually always ran at a loss, and newspapers were paid for by subsidies, ads, and the sports column. But if newspapers had never contained news and only sports, they would always have sold better. or at least been cheaper and sold the same amount.
Hmm.
When it transitioned online, the government didn't make an equivalent of media mail for newspapers that were now digital. What should have happened and could have happened was the government saying, okay, well, we used to subsidize mailing the papers. Now we will subsidize the web costs. And if you are a newspaper, the government will provide you with below cost web services or web hosting. And then this system that was never self-sustaining could continue to not be self-sustaining, but still produce the good journalism that the country needed. But because instead news was left to fend for itself when it was never a financially solvent structure in the first place, it didn't work. So this is like the tricycle problem in that the subsidy was for physically mailing papers. If the subsidy had been structured differently and were always newspapers will be subsidized so that X% of their circulation costs will be covered by the government, then we would have functional news today. It just never occurred to people in 1804 that newspapers would ever not be paper.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. Our final few questions, Ada. What is bringing you hope right now?
What's bringing me hope right now primarily is the fact that in general, there's very good news. It can be hard to find. I mentioned the website Fix the News, but it's pretty darn clear from the effects of both the 40% reduction in Amazon deforestation and the 3-time tripling of the world's solar power output last year, and the fact that solar is now actually cheaper than fossil fuels. The past 2 quarters, so end of 23 and beginning of 2024, global carbon real output has been down. That's actual adding everything together. Real carbon output is now peaked and is coming down. Right. And it's coming down faster than expected. It's coming down at the speed that the UN thinks is likely to mean that we, at our sort of probable scenario, are looking at a 1.6 degree C change before carbon is taken care of, which is way better than what it was feared. And all this news we've been having for ages about, governments are not meeting their quotas to match the Paris Accord. That's true. It doesn't matter because when solar is cheaper than fossil fuels, it doesn't matter if the governments do anything. The governments did enough. They funded the research, as did a lot of other communities, and we have the research and we've done it. And, the climate crisis is still going to require a lot of teamwork as we create social and engineering and ecosystemic resilience in order to protect communities from the effects. But we're doing it. We're doing it. It's working.
Great.
In support of that, my partner just pointed me to an article recently that he read from some business. I don't remember which business outfit, but they were ranting about the disaster, quote unquote, right, of solar energy in Germany, because about 30% of their energy is now being governed by solar energy, and it's producing so much at certain times of day that it's driving the cost of energy down. Oh, damn.
Oh, darn.
Oh, I'm so sorry for you.
We've had great leaps in battery tech with the new sodium-powered batteries. We also discovered that giant... Did you know that we discovered a new lithium deposit that's the size of all known lithium deposits all over the Earth put together?
No.
I did actually know that because Amy watches these things and it keeps me apprised.
In the Rockies, right next to all the underemployed coal mining towns that need jobs. It's like... It's just not even plausible how convenient it is. And, the whale populations are up. There was a recent wonderful 20-year study where they looked at 650 different projects that had tried to protect a endangered species, 600 conservation efforts, and 2/3 of them just worked, and those species are now okay.
Wow.
Just, enormous amounts of when we do it, actually it's working and we can do it. And a lot of those solutions to things turn out to be easier, cheaper, and more effective than we thought. And practically every species return story ends with, and then the species recovered so much faster than we ever thought they could.
That's lovely. Awesome. This is all so good to hear.
Yes.
And we never hear it, do we? I'm going to go find this Fix the News site. This is great.
Yeah, sign up. They send you a newsletter to your email inbox every week or a couple times a week with here's all the good news you didn't hear. Lots of coverage of the malaria vaccine rollout, which is going to be the largest life-saving thing ever in the history of human undertaking that is now rolling out at massive speed. Just so much good news. Just people don't expect it because it doesn't get spread because bad news gets more clicks. One of my favorite things that Fix the News did last fall, they did an analysis where they were using The Guardian as the example, and they were looking at what does The Guardian do on the days when there's no new bad news, right? What do you make be your splashy cover story on a day when nothing new that was bad actually happened that day? And about half the time, they just continue to cover whatever the bad thing was that happened yesterday. But there are sometimes days where, all of the crises are about the same as they were yesterday. Nothing in Gaza has changed. Nothing in Afghanistan has changed. Nothing in the Ukraine has changed, or in Ukraine has changed. So what do they do? And there were 2 days when there was just no new bad news to report. And on one of them, The Guardian's headline was, geologists say that in 250 million years, Europe will crash into the Americas, causing tsunamis that will destroy us all if we're still alive then. And the other one was, scientists at Stanford have new neuroscience evidence that there may not be such a thing as free will.
Oh my.
I'm like, yes.
I heard about that one. I'm like,
it's just because there was no bad news, so they needed nonsense that would sound bad. They could have covered the malaria vaccine rollout, but they didn't. Instead, in 250 million years, if we're still alive, we might die.
Wow.
God, that one makes me shake my head in dismay.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. Wow.
All right, Ada, what projects do you have coming up? Anything that you want to let our listeners know about?
Oh, too many things. Let's see. I've got 2 books coming out in early 2025. One of them, which is called Trace Elements Conversations on the Project of Science Fiction and Fantasy, is an essay collection co-authored by me and Joe Walton, which has a lot of our writings about the craft of writing, about science fiction and fantasy, about the history of science fiction, how it has been an engine of social change. It collects some of my essays from Uncanny and Strange Horizons, talking about things like how many of our narratives are about protagonists versus teams affect perceptions of social disempowerment. So lots of fun stuff in there. Also analysis of Le Guin and Delaney and stuff on disability. So that'll be really fun, coming out from Tor. And then my first stab at a pop history nonfiction book is a book called Inventing the Renaissance, The Myth of a Golden Age, which is about where this idea of the Renaissance as a golden age and then the Middle Ages as a corresponding dark age comes from. Because we have lots of great books by medievalists about why the Middle Ages are not a dark age and how awesome they are. But they all sort of need a volume 2, which is where did this slanderous idea of a dark age come from? Where did the corresponding idea of a golden age come from? How did that get constructed? So, half of the book is details about the Renaissance. What was it really like? And it has fun stories about Machiavelli and Cesare Borgia and the awesome 3-way polycule of Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan, his wife Beatrice d'Este, and his boyfriend Galahad Sanseverino, and the way the 3 of them ran the city, and, all sorts of stuff like that. Actually, when you asked me whether I use profanity, because you like to say that it's okay to say profanity on the podcast, I was tempted to say, well, then the piece of profanity I've been trying to use lately is the word prue, which comes from a letter by Francesco da Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, in which he begins the letter. This is an answer to someone who has challenged him as a duel. And he begins the answer, prue, parenthesis, that is the sound of me making a fart sound in your direction while holding up my middle finger and making a fuck you gesture behind my anus with my other hand.
Wow.
Prue is the best form of profanity I can think of.
Wow.
So the book is full of fun, colorful Renaissance anecdotes like that, but it also talks about why this myth continues, ways that 19th century nationalist movements benefited from being able to claim, once we're in power, it will be a golden age. the way that Europe in its age of empires, when it needed to justify taking over other countries and replacing their cultures, would do so by claiming we will make a golden age. The reason that this myth of a bad Middle Ages and golden Renaissance has proliferated so much is because it's such a useful narrative to talk about a dark time and a golden time. We even see it in our science fiction and fantasy. Think of how many worlds talk about there having been a golden age and a dark age. Right. We assume that there are, PSA from historians. There's no such thing as a dark age. This is all propaganda. And it's very useful to know how that propaganda works, because basically every one of us gets lied to by, a journalist or a politician about history on average twice a day. And the more we know about the constructs behind those lies, the more empowered we are to resist them. So it's half that kind of empowering approach to historical lies and half fun anecdotes about how the Renaissance was really full of gay people.
So I'm kind of an amateur medievalist. I was a Society for Creative Anachronism member, right? Not, but amateur interest in history. Yeah. Yes, the Renaissance was full of gay people, 100%.
So that's fun. And then I'm nearly done my first novel of my new series. So this will be my second series after Terra Ignota, because it's done. The new series focuses on Norse mythology and on Vikings. And the first book is called Hearthfire, and I expect it to be out in 2026.
Awesome. Sounds great. And where can people find you online?
So you can find me on adapalmer.com. I'm also on Twitter and Blue Sky and Mastodon. I usually am not very active, but I make a point of trying to share one piece of good news every day with the hashtag #ShareGoodNewsToo, which has been a fun project. So adapalmer.com. My blog is xurbe.com, where you can find fun essays about history, also other topics, including fandom topics, but mostly history. So those are the main places to find me. And Joe Walton and I do a joint podcast called Ex Urbe ad Astra, so From the City to the Stars, where we interview friends about a variety of topics. Often they will be sort of high-level discussions of the craft of writing, assuming you've already thought about the 101 kinds of questions, and then we can plunge into things. We did a podcast about chapter titles and chapter structures. How do chapters affect structuring a book? That kind of thing. And we talk to writers, but sometimes also scientists or philosophers about different topics.
Cool. Very interesting.
This is so wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so glad that I did not miss all of this. You are really interesting, and I have learned a lot today.
Well, it's been a treat. These are really fun questions. And, I love let's end with something hopeful, because, the actual most dangerous thing in our world right now is despair.
Yeah.
Despair is how we lose. And lots of things are intentionally cultivating despair because they know it's the best way to end resistance and get people to feel, we already can't possibly stop X bad thing, so we should give up.
So true.
Awesome. Yeah.
Awesome. You're right.
Thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And that was our interview with Ada Palmer. Before we continue on, just want to say, if you like what you hear, please share us with your friends on Facebook or Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever it is that you're on these days. We are currently now on Instagram. I'm trying to be more active there. Not doing a great job, but I am a little bit. If you really want to support us, you can find us at the patreon.com/ifthisgoeson. And in fact, our guest today, if you didn't catch me mentioning it way back at the beginning of the episode, our guest today was chosen by our patrons. So every now and then we do a thing. We put up some authors that we're interested in interviewing, and then we let our patrons choose one via vote. So if you would like to vote on some of our future guests, you can join our Patreon. I think that one's like $2 a month, which is almost nothing. So go out there and check that out. That would be great. If you don't want to get involved with something that's subscription, I know money's tight for everybody these days. You can always check out our Ko-fi account. That's Ko-fi. All right. And I think I'm going to leave it there with that. Diane, I'm so glad that you made it.
Me too. Oh, she was great. So interesting, so informed, obviously has really thought about things,
Oh my
always
gosh.
clearly looking for a path forward. Yeah, Ada was lots of fun. That was really great. Love that conversation.
She's one of those people that is so smart and clear thinking that I feel like I feel like a child in the wilderness.
Right? I'm proud that I could even follow the conversation, honestly. But yes,
right?
No, it was
right?
cool. He's great. Yeah, really, really cool. What a great opportunity. Clearly, the patrons were spot on. Good choice, guys. Good choice.
Yes. Yeah, and I really, that last question, I was waiting all episode to get to that question because I knew. Okay, so she was at my local conference. She was guest of honor at my local conference in 2023, and I went to a panel that talked about politics, right? And she was on it, and I heard her answers, and I was like, okay, I think we need to get her on. You know what I mean? I'm so glad that we did, and I knew she was going to have a great answer for that.
That's great. Yeah, no, I really, she's right. We don't hear about the good news out there because it's just not in the best interests of our, corporate controlled media system, which is just as true in Canada pretty much as it is in the United States these days, right? It's just not in their best interest to share things that give us peace and hope. It is far more in their interest to share things that frighten us. And for the reason she said, right? It gets more clicks, right? I'm seriously going to have to go look for this Fix the News thing. But yes,
I am.
We're on the verge, guys. We are on the verge. It's a race between human stupidity and human innovation right now as whether or not we are going to survive this whole climate change crisis. And yeah, right. I'd prefer to think that we can win.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to mention something that she said before the podcast even started, because we had a little bit of a conversation like we usually do before the podcast even starts. And I can't remember how it came up exactly, but she mentioned, another thing to consider is one more reason for hope is that right now people understand and are committed to equality more than they ever have been in the history of the world. If you think of the medieval times, people didn't even consider that to be a thing. Like that was a not acceptable idea. They just didn't think that would ever happen, right?
Yeah, the Overton window was nowhere near there, and nobody had any, speculation that a peasant might be as good as a noble. That's true.
Right. Exactly. And even though Bezos has however many billions of dollars and Musk has however many billions of dollars, the difference is that people are pushing back and people are fighting back. So
that's true.
To just keep that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just an amateur when it comes to history, but it is one of my special interests, as it were, as a neurodiverse person, right? At particular periods. But I mean, she's far more educated than me, but I'm glad that she's confirming my own belief on it. That's cool.
It's okay. I'm an amateur at nearly everything. So don't feel bad. So what are you reading right now?
I am still reading Under Heaven by Guy Gavriel Kay. It's a big book. Yeah. And
yeah, it must be.
You know what? It's fantastic. Like the more I get into it, the better I like it. I didn't say this last time because I hadn't really discovered it yet. I was still at the very beginning, but I really like his female characters. I really, really like them. They are great, right? It's a society that's sort of reminiscent of like a classical Chinese society, right? And, you can tell that that's where he's borrowing inspiration, but everything's got different names. So, and which is smart because if he makes a mistake of culture, then that way he's not offending anybody and it's his own fantasy universe, right? Where there really are ghosts of the dead, for example, and stuff like that, right? But okay, so his female characters are living under the very restricted conditions of what a woman is allowed to do in that society, right? But they are all very powerful people who are making it work. Like there's a character who is a courtesan to a high-ranking Mandarin basically, right? There's another character who is a, daughter of a prominent military family, right? Stuff like this. And they're put into these situations where they are restricted and they're not entirely able to act according to their own free will, but they are acting with agency in those situations and using what is to hand to give themselves agency. And it's really cool to watch. It's absolute top marks for me for that. Fantastic.
Love it. I love it. I love it. Yeah, it sounds so good. He's been on my list for so long. I said that last time we talked, but
you did. No, I can't recommend him enough now, actually. Great stuff.
Yeah. Awesome.
What about you?
Let me see. What am I reading right now? Yeah, I just finished reading right before this podcast, I just finished reading Ceres. That's like a Ceres, like the planet.
Okay.
By Alan Stroud, which was, I don't know if it would be called a novella or a novelette or what, but you remember when we interviewed Alan Stroud, I'm sure.
I do. Yep.
So back then, we weren't sure if the series was going to continue. Well, he had a second book, right. And then he had a series of 6 novellas or novelettes or something. And then his third novel, I don't think has quite come out yet, though I do have the arc sitting right here with me. But it is altogether called the Fractal series. And so I just finished reading the second novella in that novella series there. And pretty good. I enjoyed it. I am going to be reviewing it for my review column.
Cool.
It's hard SF, space opera-ish stuff, you know what I mean? Kind of expanse-ish in a way, lots of political stuff happening between Earth and people on Mars and an unknown other group. But there's also like clones and there's like some form of telepathy or something. And there's also aliens involved. It's not all been clearly explained yet.
Right.
But series was pretty interesting. It kind of explained a lot of what happened in the first novel without actually attaching to the first novel, which was interesting, I think, anyway. So it was pretty good. I enjoyed it. It was pretty short. It only took me a day or two to read it. My conundrum now is what to read next. I don't know. I'm kind of stuck because I've got some books to read for the review column, but our next interview I'm doing with Kat is like really soon and I haven't got the arc for it yet. So I'm like, do I want to start something now and then have to, drop it to hurry up and read that book? Or maybe I've got one of the other authors' books here. Do I want to start that? Or
good time to catch up on the short fiction you love.
Maybe. Yeah, I guess so. It's like I want to do that, but then I feel like I need to read for the review column, but I really don't. So maybe I will. Maybe I will go for the short fiction.
You got to do what you love because you love it, my friend. If you make your love entirely too much of a job, it's just
Yes.
You're not going to have any fun anymore. Then this is all going to be
That's
labor, and which it is, but it's like fun labor right now. Don't make it just a job. Don't do that to yourself.
Oh, I have something else that's pretty neat too. It's called The Women of Horror, and it's by Seb Dubinsky. And it includes interviews with people like Eugen Bacon, who has been on our show, Ellen Datlow, who has been on the show. Wait. Malka Older, who has been on the show, Nusa Ono, who has been on the show, and someone we know very well named Kat Rambo.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
That's a good one to read too, especially if it's like interviews. Right, because then you can put that down at any time and pick it up, right?
I guess so. Yeah, I might move to this too. Yeah, it's pretty neat. Seb always sends me everything that he publishes, basically, and he's like, "Here, I've got a couple for you."
Nice.
And he sent me that one over, and I was like looking through the names. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this is Kat is in here. What? Kat never even told me about it." Okay, so very excited for that.
She's doing so much all the time. She probably just forgot to mention one thing.
She is. We're all extremely busy people, and she's the busiest.
That's a fact. Yep.
That is a fact. So, all right. Well, I guess we should probably wrap it up, huh?
Sadly, yes.
All right. Well, this is Alan and Diane, and we are bringing you hope one episode at a time.
Thanks for joining us, folks, and we'll see you next time.
If This Goes On, Don't Panic is edited by Alan Bailey and produced by Ken Schrader. Our theme music is by Father Flamethrower. Additional music by Christopher Snydrosky and outro music by Sable Aradia. Intro by Dave Robison. A special thanks to our guest, Ada Palmer. Thanks again for supporting us, and we'll see you again soon.